Hello, this is Scholar Chef Dude's Math. Today in geometry, we're going to show that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So last time we looked at properties of parallelograms, but now we're going to look at ways to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, because once we know it's a parallelogram, we can use its properties. Opposite sides are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, opposite angles are congruent, diagonals bisect each other, consecutive angles add up to 180. That's things that we can use if we know it's a parallelogram. So let's start off by saying A, B, C, D, or D, C. So if AB is parallel to DC, and AD is parallel to BC. So if opposite sides are parallel, then the figure is a parallelogram. You can also say if AB is congruent to DC and AD is congruent to BC, then it's a parallelogram. So opposite sides are congruent. If both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, so angle A is congruent to angle C, and angle D is congruent to angle B, then it's a parallelogram. If one pair, if one pair of opposite sides of a quadrilateral is both congruent and parallel, so let's draw that again. A, B, C, D. This one says if, let's say for example, AB is congruent to DC and AB is parallel to DC, then it's a parallelogram. And then lastly, if the diagonals bisect each other, so let's say A, B, C, D, and let's call this middle E. So if AE is congruent to EC and BE is congruent to ED, then it's a parallelogram. So example 1, how do you know that angle B is congruent to angle D? So we're going to say if one pair of opposite sides are both parallel and congruent, then ABCD is a parallelogram. Since it's a parallelogram, then opposite angles are congruent. In a quadrilateral, GHJK, The angle measured 55, 125, 55, and angle K. Find the measure of angle K and explain how you know. So let's draw our object, which is probably a parallelogram. We label our sides here. So G, H, J, K. So they tell you that G is 55 and H is 125. And we know that J is 55. Find the measure of angle K. So we know that if we add all the interior angles in a quadrilateral, we get 360. So let's find out what that is. 55 plus 55 plus 125 plus x equals 360. So when I add those together, I will get 235 plus angle K, or x in this case, is 360. Subtract and we'll get x equals 125. Now we assumed it was probably going to be 125 because it's a parallelogram and opposite angles are parallel, but we need to prove that that is the case. Alright, how do we know that the figure shown is a parallelogram? So they're saying this length is 7 and that length is 7, and then the other two sides are 4. So because the diagonals bisect each other, that's why it's a parallelogram. So for what value of x is PQRS a parallelogram? So we know that the diagonals bisect each other, so that means 5x has to equal whatever 2x plus 9 is. Since we set them equal to each other, we can now solve for x. Subtract 2x over from both sides and get 3x equals 9. Divide both sides by 3 and we'll get x equals 3. If x equals 3, then PQRS is indeed a parallelogram. Alright, show that quadrilateral KLMN is a parallelogram. So there's a lot of ways we can do this. So there's a few ways. We can show that opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. We can show diagonals bisect each other. And then lastly, we can show one pair of opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So I'm going to go with what I find is the easiest, because if we wanted to show opposite sides are congruent, means the same length, we would have to use the distance formula. To show that they're parallel, we're just going to use the slope formula. So for example, the slope of KL, so remember the slope formula is rise over run. The difference of your y's over the difference over your x's. So if I'm looking at KL, for example, from K to L, 4 minus 2 over 4 minus 2. And that'll give us 2 over 2, which is 1. If we look at the opposite side, that's NM. That's 0 minus minus 2. Okay, that's my y values. And then 6 minus 4. So I'll get 2 over 2, which is 1. So they're the same slope. Okay, now we're going to look at nk, or kn. So I'm doing the left side now. And I'm going to do 2 minus negative 2 over 2 minus 4. And that'll give us 4 over negative 2, which is negative 2. And then LM, 4 minus 0 over 4 minus 6. That'll give us 4 over negative 2, which is the same thing. So since we showed that opposite sides are parallel, have the same slope, they are, that is a parallelogram. Checkpoint 3, using the same figure, explain another way to show that the quadrilateral, well, again, we can use the distance formula to show that opposite sides are congruent. Let's show the diagonals bisect each other by showing that they have the same midpoint. So for example, looking at Km, so K is 2, 2, M is 6, 0. Midpoint formula is we add the x's together and divide by 2, and then we add the y's together and divide by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So the midpoint of that is 4, 1. And then we find the midpoint of the other diagonal. So Ln, L is 4, 4. N is 4, negative 2. So the midpoint would be 4 plus 4 divided by 2. And then add your y's together. 4 plus a negative 2 divided by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. And 4 plus a negative 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So because they have the same midpoint, it's a parallelogram. Hopefully this helped you out. Have a good day.